My thumb hovered over the cracked, glowing screen. On it, Greg was sobbing. His face was a swollen canvas of purple and yellow, begging for a ransom from some concrete hellhole in Myanmar. The last time I saw this video, I sold, my house drained my retirement, and died in a muddy ditch trying to get him out. This time, I felt the heavy cast iron pan heating up behind me. I locked the screen, slid the phone into my pocket, and went back to chopping garlic. Death doesn't feel like going to sleep. It feels like drowning in hot asphalt. I remember the tearing sensation in my abdomen, the sickly sweet smell of rotting vegetation, and the sound of my own wet breathing echoing in the dense Myanmar jungle. I remember Greg's boots, the expensive leather ones I bought him for his birthday, sprinting away through the mud, slipping slightly, but never stopping. He didn't look back. The cartel guys were laughing. Then, the heavy, blunt force of the rifle butt coming down on my skull. And then I was standing in my kitchen. My hand jerked, knocking the wooden cutting board. A single clove of garlic rolled off the edge and hit the cheap linoleum floor. I sucked in a breath, tasting not blood and swamp water, but the sharp, acrid smoke of burning olive oil. I spun around. The stove burner was on high. The cast iron skillet was smoking a thin gray plume, reaching for the grease-stained vent hood. My heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I grabbed a kitchen towel, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it, and dragged the heavy pan off the heat. The hiss of the metal cooling was the only sound in the room, save for the dull, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. I leaned heavily against the counter, pressing the heels of my hands into my eyes, until bursts of static exploded behind my eyelids. I was wearing my gray sweatpants, the ones with the fraying drawstring. My feet were bare, the cold floor biting into my heels. There was no bullet wound in my stomach, no mud caked under my fingernails. I opened my eyes and looked at the digital clock on the microwave. October 14th, 6:42 p.m., 3 years ago. I stumbled to the bathroom, kicking the door open, and gripped the edges of the porcelain sink. The face, staring back at me in the mirror, was younger, softer. The deep, graying lines around my mouth that the bankruptcy and the stress had carved were gone. The scar on my collarbone from the first extortion attempt was missing. I ran trembling fingers over the smooth skin of my neck. I was alive. I was back. A sharp, vibrating buzz broke the silence. It was coming from the kitchen island. My phone. A cold dread coiled in my gut, heavy and familiar. I knew exactly what that notification was. Muscle memory propelled me out of the bathroom and back into the kitchen. The screen was lit up, displaying a WhatsApp message from an unknown international number, a video file. I stared at it. The familiar green icon mocked me. In my past life, I opened it immediately. I saw Greg's battered face. I heard the desperate pitch of his voice, the muffled sounds of a generator, and distant, mocking laughter in a language I didn't understand. I had panicked. I had called my sister Sarah and listened to her scream until my own eardrums rang. I had become the dutiful brother, the fixer, the one who mortgaged his future to pay the first ransom, the one who flew to Bangkok, then crossed the border illegally, paying smugglers and fixers because the embassy was too slow. I did it all for Sarah, because she cried, because she said she couldn't live without him, because Greg, despite being a leech who blew our parents' inheritance on a string of failed crypto startups, was family. And in return, when the deal went south in that humid warehouse, when the traffickers realized I had no more money to drain. Greg pointed at me. "Take him," he had screamed, his voice cracking. "He's got good kidneys. He's got credit lines. Just let me go." I reached out and tapped the screen. The video buffered for a fraction of a second. There he was, Greg. The lighting was harsh, fluorescent, and flickering. He was kneeling on a concrete floor stained with something dark. His left eye was swollen shut, a grotesque shade of plum. A thin trail of snot and blood leaked from his nose, catching in his patchy beard. "Arthur?" He sobbed, his voice, thin and reedy, over the compressed audio. "Arthur, please, man. You have to help me. They're going to kill me. They want 200,000. Sarah doesn't have it. I know she doesn't. Please, Arthur. I'm sorry about the business. I'm sorry about everything. Just please." In the background, a man holding a metal pipe walked into the frame, tapping it rhythmically against his palm. The video cut off. I stood there, the harsh white light of the phone illuminating my face. I waited for the panic to rise. I waited for the suffocating sense of duty to wrap around my throat. I waited for the adrenaline spike that would send me rushing for my wallet, my passport, my keys. Instead, I noticed the smell in the kitchen. I had burned the oil. The garlic on the cutting board was waiting. I was hungry. My thumb hovered over the screen. The video was set to autoplay, looping Greg's panicked, bloodied face. "Arthur, please, man. They're going to kill me." A strange, hollow sensation bloomed in my chest. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't sadistic joy. It was just emptiness. The kind of profound, ringing emptiness you feel when a deafening alarm is finally switched off. For 34 years, I had been the designated shock absorber for my family. When Dad died, I handled the funeral while Sarah mourned. When Sarah married Greg, a man who wore suits that were too shiny and spoke in buzzwords, I paid for the catering. When Greg's first logistics company went under, I quietly co-signed a loan so they wouldn't lose their house. I looked at the phone. My finger twitched. I could forward it to the FBI. I could call Sarah. I could start the cycle again. I pressed the power button on the side of the phone. The screen went black. The silence in the apartment was absolute. I walked over to the trash can, picked up the dropped clove of garlic from the floor, and tossed it in. Then I turned back to the stove. I wiped the cast iron clean with a paper towel, the residual heat warming the skin of my knuckles. I poured in a fresh glug of olive oil. Not the cheap stuff this time. The good, grassy oil I kept in the back of the pantry for special occasions. I turned the flame on low. I took the flat of my chef's knife and pressed it against a fresh clove of garlic. Crack. The dry, papery skin gave way. I peeled it, the sticky juice coating my fingertips. I minced it, focusing entirely on the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the blade against the wood. $200,000, the ghost of Greg's voice, echoed in my mind. I scraped the minced garlic into the warm oil. It didn't burn this time. It sizzled gently, releasing a pungent, earthy fragrance that immediately chased away the metallic phantom smell of blood. I watched the tiny pieces dance in the golden liquid, waiting for them to turn the exact shade of pale blonde. Greg had gone to Myanmar on a networking retreat. That's what he told Sarah. I knew, even in the previous life, that it was a desperate gamble to recoup the money he'd lost trading altcoins. He thought he was smarter than the syndicates operating in the Golden Triangle. He thought he could out-hustle the cartels. I reached into the fridge and pulled out a tube of tomato paste. I squeezed a generous dollop into the pan, stirring it into the garlic. The sizzle grew louder, angrier. The paste began to caramelize, sticking to the bottom of the iron, turning a deep, rich brick red. I needed to deglaze the pan. I grabbed a half-empty bottle of Cabernet from the counter. I splashed it in. Hiss. A cloud of steam rose, smelling of dark berries and alcohol. I scraped the bottom of the pan with a wooden spoon, lifting the browned bits of flavor, watching the harsh, acidic liquid reduce and thicken. This was control. This was a process with predictable outcomes. If you manage the heat, if you balance the acid and the fat, you get a good sauce. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the chaos of human beings. You could give a man everything you had bleed yourself dry for him, and he would still throw you to the wolves to buy himself another hour of breathing. I dropped a handful of cherry tomatoes into the sauce, watching their skins blister and pop in the heat. The phone vibrated against the wood of the island. It wasn't a message this time. It was a call. The screen lit up. Sarah. I stared at the name. In the other timeline, I had answered on the first ring. She had been hyperventilating, unintelligible. The video had broken her. I picked up a pinch of kosher salt, rubbing the coarse grains between my thumb and index finger, feeling their sharp edges. I sprinkled it over the simmering tomatoes. The phone kept buzzing. It vibrated its way an inch across the counter. I let it ring. I walked over to the sink and filled a large steel pot with water. I carried it to the other burner, turned the flame on high, and heavily salted the water until it tasted like the sea. The phone stopped. The screen went dark. I exhaled a long, slow breath that shuddered slightly on the way out. My hands were perfectly steady now. I stirred the sauce. It was coming together nicely. The tomatoes were breaking down their juices, melding with the wine and the oil. Then, the phone started ringing again. Sarah. She wasn't going to stop. I knew my sister. If I didn't answer, she would drive over. She would pound on my door and shatter the fragile, quiet sanctuary I was building in this kitchen. I wiped my hands on the towel, picked up the phone, and swiped right. Arthur. Her voice was sharp, a jagged edge of panic slicing through the phone's speaker. Hey, Sarah, I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Calm, flat, utterly disconnected. I cradled the phone between my ear and my shoulder so I could keep my hands free. I picked up a block of Parmigiano Reggiano and a microplane. Arthur. Oh my God, have you seen it? Did you get a message? She was breathless, pacing. I could hear the sharp click of her heels on the hardwood floor of her suburban house, the house I was currently helping pay the mortgage on. Get a message from who? I asked, dragging the hard cheese across the razor-sharp teeth of the grater. The cheese fell in a soft, snowy mound onto the cutting board. Shk, shk, shk. From, I don't know, an unknown number. It's a video. It's Greg Arthur. Something's wrong. Something's horribly wrong. Her voice cracked, pitching upward into a sob. He's hurt Arthur. He's bleeding. Slow down, I said softly, watching the pasta water come to a rolling boil. I broke a handful of linguine in half a sin in any Italian kitchen, but I didn't care tonight and dropped it into the pot. What do you mean he's bleeding? Isn't he in Thailand at a conference? I don't know, she wailed. The video. There are guys in the background. They want money. They want $200,000. Arthur, where the hell is he? I stirred the pasta, making sure it didn't stick to the bottom. Did you call the police? The police. Arthur, they're overseas. The police here can't do anything. I called the local precinct, and they gave me a number for the State Department, and I've been on hold for 20 minutes. She was spiraling. In the past, This was the exact moment I stepped in. This was the moment I said, "I'll handle it, Sarah. Let me look at our finances. I'll make some calls." This was the moment I traded my life for his. I pinched a single strand of linguine out of the boiling water, blowing on it lightly before biting into it. A bit too much chalk in the center. It needed another 2 minutes. "You should stay on the line with the State Department," I said, my tone even. "They're the professionals." The line went dead quiet for a second. The background noise of her pacing stopped. "Stay on the line," Sarah repeated, her voice dropping an octave. The panic briefly replaced by disbelief. "Arthur, did you hear me? They have Greg. They're going to hurt him." "I heard you, Sarah, but neither of us has $200,000. You have equity in your apartment," she blurted out. The words hung in the air. I closed my eyes. The smell of the tomato sauce suddenly faded, replaced by the ghost memory of the humid, suffocating air of the compound. I remembered the loan officer's sympathetic but firm face when I took out the second mortgage. I remembered the crippling anxiety of transferring the funds to an untraceable offshore account. I remembered Sarah telling me I was a hero, right up until the moment the money vanished. The demands doubled, and she turned on me, asking why I hadn't negotiated better. She didn't hesitate. 3 minutes into the crisis, and she was already spending my home. "No," I said quietly. "No. What do you mean?" "No, Arthur, this is my husband. My apartment is my home, Sarah. I'm not taking out a loan to pay a ransom to an international syndicate." I took the pasta pot off the flame and carried it to the sink, dumping it into a colander. The steam billowed up hot and wet against my face. "Are you insane?" she shrieked. "He will die. Do you understand me? If we don't pay them, he is going to die. Then he shouldn't have gone to Myanmar to buy illegal crypto rigs." "Sarah." Silence. A long, heavy silence. The only sound was the water draining from the sink. "How do you know he's in Myanmar?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "The video. He didn't say where he was." I froze for a fraction of a second. A slip. I had retained the knowledge of the past, but I had to be careful not to show my hand too early. "It's a guess," I lied smoothly. "Where else do these scam compounds operate? He's been talking about Southeast Asian tech hubs for months. It's not hard to put 2 and 2 together." You're being a monster," she breathed. "I don't even know who you are right now. My husband is being tortured, and you sound like you're reading a grocery list." "I'm making dinner, Sarah. I'm coming over," she snapped, the fury finally overtaking the fear. "Don't you dare ignore me. I'm coming over right now." "Don't," I said, but she had already hung up. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen. I tossed it onto the sofa in the living room. I took the drained pasta and slid it directly into the skillet with the thick, rich red sauce. I turned the heat back up for just a moment, tossing the linguine so every strand was coated, watching the starchy pasta water bind the sauce into a glossy perfection. I plated it in a wide, shallow bowl. I sprinkled the freshly grated Parmesan over the top, watching it melt instantly into the heat. I added a crack of black pepper. I carried the bowl to the small dining table by the window. Outside, the city was dark streetlights cutting through the October mist. I sat down, picked up my fork, and twirled the pasta. I took a bite. It was perfect. The acidity of the wine, the sweetness of the tomatoes, the sharp bite of the garlic. It was warm, heavy, and real. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, Greg was waiting for a savior that wasn't coming. And a few miles away, my sister was getting into her car, bringing a hurricane of entitlement and grief toward my door. I took another bite, chewing slowly. Let them come. I had a lot of eating to do. The pounding on my front door didn't start as a knock. It started as an assault. The cheap brass hinges rattled against the door frame, the wood vibrating with the force of two balled fists. I was halfway through my plate of pasta, the sauce having cooled into a thick, savory glaze. I didn't rush. I swallowed the bite in my mouth, wiped the corner of my lips with a paper napkin, and pushed the chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the linoleum. "Arthur, open the goddamn door." Sarah's voice was muffled by the thick wood, but the jagged hysteria in her tone pierced right through it. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Sarah practically fell into the entryway. The cold October air rushed in, with her carrying the metallic scent of wet asphalt. But underneath that was a cloying, heavy wave of her perfume, a sickeningly sweet, floral scent that she bathed in. It instantly clashed with the lingering smell of roasted garlic and tomatoes in my kitchen, creating a nauseating dissonance. She looked entirely unglued. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was staticky and windblown. Black streaks of mascara cut uneven paths down her flushed cheeks, pooling in the fine lines around her mouth. She was wearing a beige trench coat, thrown haphazardly over a pair of silk pajamas. "How can you be eating?" she gasped, her eyes darting past me to the dining table. "How are you sitting here eating pasta when they are cutting off his fingers?" "Arthur, nobody is cutting off his fingers." "Sarah," I said, my voice deliberately low. I closed the door behind her, shutting out the draft. "You don't know that." She shoved her phone into my chest. The screen was cracked, the brightness turned all the way up. "Look at it. Look at the second message they just sent." I didn't reach for the phone. I looked down at the screen. It was a still photograph this time. Greg was tied to a plastic lawn chair. His shirt was off, and his pale, slightly doughy chest was bruised. A man in a surgical mask was standing behind him, holding a pair of heavy industrial pliers near Greg's right hand. I felt a ghost pain in my own ribs, a phantom memory of a boot kicking me into the dirt while I vomited muddy water. I pushed the memory down, focusing on the harsh glare of the screen and the erratic, shallow panting of my sister. "It's theatrical," I said, stepping back so her phone wasn't pressing into my sternum. "It's a pressure tactic. If they mangle his hands, he can't type on a keyboard. He's useless to them in a scam farm if he can't type. They want money, Sarah. Mangling him decreases their return on investment." Sarah stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, like a suffocating fish. "Return on investment," she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. "Are you talking about my husband, like he's a stock portfolio? I'm talking about the reality of human trafficking cartels." I replied, walking back to my table and picking up my wine glass. I took a sip. It was cheap, Cabernet Tart, and thin, but it coated my tongue nicely. They run these places like corporations. Fear is just their marketing department. "You're a sociopath." She backed away from me, her heels clicking against the floorboards. "When did you become a sociopath? 3 hours ago, you were my brother. You've always been the one to fix things. When Mom died, when the roof caved in on our first house, you were there. You fixed things. Arthur, I fixed things because you refused to," I said. The words tasted like ash, but I let them out anyway. "I fixed the roof because Greg spent the repair budget on a crypto mining rig that caught fire in your garage. I handled Mom's funeral because you locked yourself in a hotel room for a week and left me with the coroner. I am tired of fixing things, Sarah, and I am definitely not fixing this by selling my home." It's $200,000. We can get a hard money loan. We can put your apartment up as collateral. I'll pay you back, Arthur. I swear to God, I will pay every single cent back. She was weeping now, ugly guttural sobs that shook her shoulders. In the past timeline, this was the exact sound that broke me. This was the sound that bypassed my logic and activated 30 years of deeply ingrained toxic sibling guilt. I had held her on this very floor while she cried, stroking her hair, promising her I would make it okay. I promised I would bring Greg back. I looked at her now. I saw the desperation, but I also saw the profound entitlement. She didn't want to save Greg with her own sacrifice. She wanted me to be the sacrificial lamb. How? I asked softly. She sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup further. What? How will you pay me back? Sarah Gregg's logistics company is $90,000 in the red. Your credit cards are maxed out. You haven't worked in 6 years. If I sign this apartment over to a loan shark, I lose it. I end up on the street. And Greg comes home, rests up, and starts another grift. What's the plan to pay me back? I'll get a job. Greg will turn it around. This will change him. She stepped forward, grabbing the sleeve of my sweater. Her fingernails dug into the wool. Please, he's family. You don't abandon family. Greg isn't family, I said gently, but firmly, prying her fingers off my arm. Greg is a parasite who finally latched onto a host bigger and meaner than him. And you are my sister, but you are not my dependent. I am not doing it. Her face changed. The sorrow evaporated, replaced by a cold, venomous rage that tightened the skin around her eyes. She took a step back, looking at me as if she had just found a roach in her bedsheets. You're going to let him die, she stated. It wasn't a question. I am not doing anything, I corrected her. Greg walked into a jungle. I am just choosing not to follow him. I hate you, she hissed, her voice vibrating with a hatred so pure it physically moved the air between us. If he dies, his blood is on your hands, Arthur. I will make sure everyone knows. I will make sure you die alone in this pathetic little box of an apartment. She spun on her heel and marched to the door, tearing it open. She didn't look back as she slammed it shut behind her. The brass hinges rattled again, a final violent punctuation mark. I stood in the silence of my kitchen. The floral stench of her perfume lingered heavy and suffocating. I walked over to the window, unlocked it, and pushed it open. The cold October wind swept in, blowing the napkins off the table, clearing the air. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. Midnight. The apartment was pitch black, save for the sickly, blue glow illuminating my face. I was sitting on the edge of the couch, the rough, cheap fabric of the upholstery biting into the bare skin of my calves. Outside, it had started to rain, a steady rhythmic drumming against the window pane that sounded like static. My phone vibrated in my palm. Unknown number. I had blocked the first 2 numbers they used, but they were routing through internet proxies. They could generate 100 new numbers a minute. I swiped the screen to unlock it. A new video message. In my previous life, I had watched every single frame they sent. I had tortured myself with the footage, memorizing the layout of the concrete room, the sound of the generator in the background, trying to glean some clue I could give to the useless authorities. Every scream from Greg had been a chisel, chipping away at my resolve until I was hollowed out enough to sign the mortgage papers. Now I tapped the play button with a morbid, detached curiosity. The video loaded. It was poorly lit, the camera shaking slightly. The same fluorescent lights hummed violently overhead. Greg was on his knees. He looked worse. The swelling around his eye had blackened, and there was a dark, wet stain on the collar of his polo shirt. But it wasn't Greg talking this time. A man stepped into the frame. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, a surgical mask obscuring the lower half of his face. He looked painfully young, maybe 22, but his eyes were flat, dead. "Hello, Arthur," the man said. His English was heavily accented, careful, and precise. "Your sister says you are the man with the money. She says you have property. We don't want to hurt Greg. We are businessmen. We just want what is owed to us for his travel and accommodations. $200,000 US. You have 48 hours to initiate a transfer to the routing number we provide. After that, we send you pieces of him. And then we sell what is left to the medical brokers." The man reached down and grabbed a fistful of Greg's hair, yanking his head back. Greg let out a wet, pathetic whimper. "Tell your brother-in-law to pay Greg," the masked man ordered. Greg stared into the camera. His eyes were wide, glassy, with a terror so profound it looked like madness. "Arthur, Artie, please." They showed me the clinic downstairs. God, please, the smell. "Artie, I don't want to die here. I'll pay you back. I'll work at a grocery store. I'll do anything. Just get me out of here. Please, man. Please." The video ended. I sat in the dark, listening to the rain. Artie. He hadn't called me that since the day they got married. It was a cheap, manipulative attempt at intimacy. I felt a sudden sharp tightness in my chest, a localized pressure right over my sternum. For a terrifying second, I thought it was guilt. I thought the old conditioning was kicking in, the programmed response to sacrifice myself on the altar of my family's dysfunction. I closed my eyes and focused on the sensation. It wasn't guilt. It was panic. But not for Greg. It was the visceral memory of the mud. My mind violently pulled me back to the jungle. I could feel the suffocating 100-degree heat wrapping around my throat like a wet towel. I could hear the buzzing of the cicadas so loud it sounded like a chainsaw in my brain. I remembered handing over the duffel bag of cash, every cent I had, every cent I had borrowed, to a man with a gold tooth and a machete. I remembered the man laughing. I remembered Greg being shoved out of the back of a rusted Toyota Hilux. And I remembered the gunshot, not aimed at Greg, aimed at me. They had taken the money, and they had taken my life, because I was the loose end. And Greg hadn't even screamed. He had just scrambled away, slipping in the mud, leaving me bleeding out in a ditch, while the syndicate boys went through my pockets. I opened my eyes. I was back on my couch in my cold, quiet apartment. My chest was heaving. I wiped a sheen of cold sweat from my forehead. The cartel wasn't negotiating. They were farming. They found a vulnerable cow, and they were milking it for every drop of liquid capital it had. Paying them didn't buy freedom. It just upgraded you from a nuisance to a premium customer. If I sent the money, they would just ask for another $200,000. I looked at the phone. The routing number was sitting in a text message below the video. I tapped the text box. I didn't type a plea. I didn't threaten them. I simply typed, "He's not my problem. Keep him." I hit send. Then I turned the phone completely off, tossed it onto the coffee table, and lay back on the couch. The silence that followed was heavy, almost oppressive. I lay there for hours, listening to the rain slowly taper off into a faint drizzle, watching the shadows stretch and shift across the ceiling as cars drove by outside. I waited for the crushing weight of remorse to hit me. I waited to feel like a monster. But as the first pale, bruised light of dawn began to creep through the window, blinds painting the room in shades of gray, all I felt was an overwhelming, profound exhaustion. And beneath that, a tiny, fragile spark of something I hadn't felt in over a decade. Freedom. The next morning, the city didn't care that Greg was tied to a chair in a sweat-stained room in Southeast Asia. I walked down to the corner bodega, the harsh morning sunlight making my eyes water. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of roasted coffee beans from the cafe next door, and the sharp tang of exhaust from a passing delivery truck. People were rushing to the subway, clutching paper cups, their faces buried in their coats. The absolute indifference of the world was comforting. I bought a black coffee, feeling the heat seep through the thin cardboard cup, warming my stiff fingers. When I got back to my apartment, the air felt stale. The remnants of last night's argument hung in the corners of the room, like invisible cobwebs. I ignored the powered-down phone on the coffee table. I walked straight to my small desk in the corner of the bedroom and opened my laptop. It was time to dismantle the bomb before the blast radius reached me. In my past life, I hadn't just paid the ransom. I had financially bled out in 1,000 small cuts leading up to it. I logged into my primary banking portal. The screen glowed with cold, hard numbers. First, I found the joint checking account I had opened with Sarah 5 years ago to help her manage Mom's estate. After the estate was settled, she had kept it open occasionally, dipping into it for emergencies, which usually meant covering overdraft fees from Greg's accounts. I had set up an automatic transfer of $300 a month into it, a silent subsidy to keep them afloat. I clicked Manage Recurring Transfers. I selected the $300 output. I clicked Cancel. The screen refreshed. Done. Next was the credit card. 2 years ago, Greg had maxed out his business lines and couldn't rent a cargo van for a lucrative contract he swore would turn everything around. I had added him as an authorized user on one of my high-limit cards. The van had been returned late dented, and the contract had vanished. The card currently had a balance of $4,200, all his charges. I clicked through the labyrinthine menus of the banking site, navigating the endless prompts designed to keep you from changing your account. Finally, I found the authorized user list. Gregory T. I clicked Remove. A pop-up asked me if I was sure. It warned me that a replacement card would not be issued to this user. I pressed the trackpad down hard. Confirm. I sat back sipping the cheap bodega coffee. It was bitter and burnt, a terrible roast, but I drank it down like it was medicine. My sister's words from last night echoed in my head. You fix things, Arthur. You're a sociopath. Society conditions you to believe that blood is an unbreakable contract. That family is a blank check you have to honor, regardless of how thoroughly the account has been overdrawn. But what happens when the family member is a leak in the hull of your life? What happens when their survival requires your drowning? I opened a new tab and logged into my mortgage portal. The balance was there, a steady, manageable number that I had been chipping away at for 7 years. This was my sanctuary. This brick-and-mortar box in a noisy city was the only thing I owned that was purely mine. It wasn't collateral. It wasn't a bargaining chip. In the other timeline, I had liquidated this equity in 48 hours. I had signed papers with a predatory lender whose office smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. I had traded 30 years of financial security for a duffel bag of cash that ended up smeared with my own blood. I closed the laptop. I looked at the powered-down phone on the coffee table in the other room. Sarah was undoubtedly trying to reach me. The cartel was probably sending more videos, escalating their threats, tightening the screws. A sudden sharp urge to turn the phone on gripped me. It was a withdrawal symptom. The addict craving the chaos. I wanted to see the wreckage. I wanted to see if Greg was broken yet. I wanted to know if my message had sent the cartel into a rage. I stood up the chair, scraping against the floor, and walked into the living room. I stared at the black rectangle of glass. If I turned it on, the poison would leak back into the room. The screaming, the begging, the guilt. I picked up the phone. It felt heavy, a brick of condensed anxiety. I walked into the kitchen, opened the junk drawer next to the oven, a chaotic mess of rubber bands, takeout menus, and dead batteries, and dropped the phone inside. I slammed the drawer shut. I walked over to the sink and turned on the tap, letting the cold water run over my wrists. The shock of the temperature grounded me. I was a monster. I let the thought roll around in my head, testing its weight. Yes, by every metric of suburban morality, by every standard of sibling loyalty, I was a monster. I was letting a man be tortured. I was letting my sister's life implode. I was hoarding my resources while they begged for their lives. I turned off the tap and dried my hands on a dish towel. If being a good man meant dying in a mud-choked ditch in a foreign country for a coward who wouldn't even look back, then I gladly embraced the monstrousness. I would rather be the villain of Sarah's story than a corpse in my own. I walked to the closet, pulled out my heavy wool coat, and slipped my arms into the sleeves. I didn't have a phone, but I had a pocket full of cash and an entire Saturday ahead of me. I stepped out of the apartment, locking the deadbolt with a solid, satisfying click, and walked down the hall. I didn't look back. There was nothing left in that apartment but ghosts I had already laid to rest. The city on a Saturday morning is a machine waking up ignorant of the microscopic tragedies playing out inside its concrete grid. I walked for 40 blocks. I let the biting wind numb my cheeks and chap my lips. I needed the physical sensation of the cold to flush the lingering heat of the jungle out of my muscle memory. I stopped at a diner in Hell's Kitchen. The place smelled of old grease bleach and burnt coffee. It was perfect. I slid into a vinyl booth that had a piece of silver duct tape patching a tear in the seat. "Coffee?" the waitress asked. She looked tired, a faded name tag reading Patty pinned to her stained apron. "Just coffee, black, and a side of rye toast dry," I said. I watched the people outside the grease-streaked window. A guy walking a bulldog, a woman arguing furiously into her AirPods. Normalcy. In my previous life, I had spent this exact Saturday frantically pacing the floors of a bank branch, begging a junior loan officer to bypass the 72-hour underwriting period on a second mortgage. I had sweated through my shirt. I had cried in front of a stranger in a cheap suit. Patty dropped the thick ceramic mug on the table. A little black liquid sloshed over the rim, pooling on the formica. I took a sip. It was acidic, sitting heavy in my empty stomach. I paid, leaving a 20 on the table, and walked out. 2 blocks down was a chain electronics store. I walked in, bypassing the gleaming displays of smartphones, and found the prepaid rack in the back. I bought a plastic-wrapped burner phone and a $50 refill card with cash. I sat on a cold stone bench in a nearby park to set it up. My fingers tore at the stiff clamshell, packaging the sharp plastic biting into my thumbnail. I punched in the activation codes, listening to the robotic voice on the other end. Once it was live, I didn't call Sarah. I called my bank. I spent 45 minutes navigating automated menus, typing my social security number into the keypad and answering security questions. I put a hard freeze on my credit if Sarah tried to forge my signature on a loan document, and in her current state of hysteria, I wouldn't put it past her. She'd hit a brick wall. Then I dialed my own cell phone number to check the voicemail. You have 14 new messages. I listened to the first one. It was Sarah. Arthur, pick up the phone. I swear to God, pick up the phone. I called the State Department again. They said they have a liaison in Yangon, but they can't authorize a tactical extraction. They told me to advise the family not to pay the ransom, Arthur. They told me to just wait. I can't wait. Call me back. I pressed 3 to delete it. The next few were variations of the same panic. By the 8th message, the tone shifted. The fury had burned out, leaving only a hollow, scraping despair. Artie, her voice was a cracked whisper, accompanied by the wet sound of sniffling. Artie, please. I know Greg messed up. I know he lost Mom's money. I know he's a screw-up. But he's the only thing I have. Please. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll write a contract. I'll clean your house every week for the rest of my life. Just don't let them kill him. My jaw tightened. I looked at the gray sky above the bare branches of the park trees. The plea was agonizingly sad. It tugged at the deeply buried roots of my childhood, the instinct to protect my little sister from the monsters under the bed. But the monsters weren't under the bed anymore. They were heavily armed syndicates in Southeast Asia, and handing them my life wouldn't buy her peace. It would just teach them that she had a funding source. I deleted the message. I deleted all of them. I took the burner phone, popped the back off, snapped the SIM card in half, and dropped the plastic pieces into a municipal trash can. When I returned to my apartment building a few hours later, a dark blue sedan was parked illegally in front of the fire hydrant. A man in a cheap, off-the-rack gray suit was leaning against the fender, scrolling on his phone. He looked up as I approached the steps. Arthur Sterling, he asked. I stopped on the bottom step. I hadn't seen this man in my previous life. Then again, in my previous life, I was already halfway to Bangkok by now. Who's asking? I said, keeping my hands in my coat pockets. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold shield. Special Agent Miller, FBI. Mind if we go upstairs and have a chat? I prefer out here, I said, my voice flat. The air is better. Miller pocketed the badge and sighed, a plume of white condensation escaping his lips. Suit yourself. I'm here because your sister Sarah has been calling our field office every hour on the hour. She forwarded us some videos of her husband Gregory. She also mentioned that you were the designated point of contact for the ransom. I'm not the point of contact for anything, I replied. I got a spam message. I ignored it. Mr. Sterling, Miller said, taking a step closer. He smelled of stale tobacco and peppermint gum. Your brother-in-law is currently being held by a heavily organized scam syndicate, likely in the Mayawati region of Myanmar. These are brutal people. Your sister is under the impression that you have the capital to meet their demands, and that you are refusing to do so. My finances are my business, Agent Miller. They are, he agreed easily, holding up a hand. I'm not here to audit you. Honestly, our official policy is to strictly advise families against paying ransoms. It funds terrorism, it fuels the industry, and it rarely guarantees the victim's safe return. Then we're on the same page, I said. Have a good day. I turned to walk up the steps. But Miller called out, his voice, sharp enough to make me pause. You should know how this usually plays out. If you don't pay, they won't just kill him. Killing him is a waste of a resource. They'll break him. They'll torture him on camera to squeeze you. And when they realize the well is dry, they'll put him in a cubicle. They'll force him to scam grandmothers out of their pensions. They'll beat him with metal pipes if he doesn't meet his quota. He will be a slave, Mr. Sterling, until he drops dead of exhaustion or infection. I looked back down at him. The cold wind whipped a piece of trash across the sidewalk between us. Did you come here to guilt-trip me on my sister's behalf? Agent Miller, I came here. Miller said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Because I deal with families in this situation all the time. Usually, they are frantic. Usually, they are trying to wire their life savings to an offshore account, and I have to physically stop them. You went out for breakfast. You put a freeze on your credit. I'm just trying to figure out what kind of guy watches his brother-in-law get tortured and just goes about his Saturday. The kind of guy who knows that setting himself on fire won't keep his brother-in-law warm. I said, tell Sarah to stop calling my phone and tell her to sell her own house if she wants to fund a cartel. I walked up the stairs, unlocked the heavy glass lobby door, and left Miller standing on the sidewalk. I didn't tremble. I didn't look back. I just walked to the elevator, watching the rusted floor indicator slowly count down to the lobby. The 48-hour deadline was set for Sunday at 6 p.m. By 4 p.m., the sky outside my window had bruised into a deep, ugly purple. The rain had returned, slicking the streets and blurring the streetlights into smeared halos of orange. I was in the kitchen, carefully stripping the leaves off a sprig of fresh rosemary. The sharp, piney scent clung to my fingertips. I had a thick, heavily marbled ribeye steak sitting on a wooden board, coming up to room temperature. I patted it completely dry with a paper towel and rubbed a generous amount of coarse sea salt into the fat cap. The buzzer for the downstairs lobby rang. It was a harsh, electrical jarring sound that made the silence in the apartment shatter. I ignored it. It rang again, a long, sustained buzz that lasted for 10 seconds, then silence, then another 10 seconds. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked over to the intercom by the door, and pressed the listen button. I heard the faint, crackling sound of traffic, and then heavy, ragged breathing. Arthur, Sarah's voice filtered through the ancient speaker. It sounded distorted, metallic. I know you're up there. The FBI agent said he talked to you. I'm coming up. She must have waited for a neighbor to open the door and slipped in behind them. I stepped back from the intercom. I walked to the deadbolt, double-checked that it was locked, and stood in the small entryway waiting. A minute later, the soft pad of footsteps sounded on the hallway runner outside. Then a knock, weak, exhausted. Arthur, open the door, please. I opened it, leaving the chain engaged. The door cracked open 3 inches. Sarah stood in the hallway. If she had looked unglued on Friday, she looked entirely destroyed now. She was wearing the same trench coat, but it was soaked through, clinging heavily to her shoulders. Her face was gray, the skin tight over her cheekbones. She held a heavy canvas tote bag in her right hand, her knuckles white from the grip. The cloying perfume was gone, replaced by the sour, sharp smell of unwashed hair, damp wool, and stale sweat. Take the chain off, she whispered. Say what you have to say from there, Sarah. She stared at me through the gap, her eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. It's 4:30. They sent another video an hour ago. They put a plastic bag over his head, Arthur. They held it there until he passed out. They said, if the money isn't in escrow by 6, they're cutting off his ear and mailing it to my house. I looked at the water dripping from the hem of her coat onto my floorboards. I'm sorry, Sarah. Stop saying you're sorry, she suddenly screamed, slamming her free hand against the door. The wood shuddered against the chain. You're not sorry. You're a cold, selfish bastard. She dropped the canvas tote bag. It hit the hallway floor with a heavy metallic clatter. She knelt down frantic and ripped the bag open. She started pulling things out, shoving them into the narrow gap of the door. Here, she gasped, her breath coming in ragged hitches. This is Mom's silver tea set. It's antique. It's worth a few thousand. And here, this is my engagement ring. The diamond is 1.5 carats. I have the title to my car in here. It's a 2019, it's paid off. She was shoving the velvet ring box and a stack of folded papers at me. They fell to the floor inside my apartment. I'll sell it all, she babbled, looking up at me from her knees, the water from her coat pooling around her on the ugly hallway carpet. I just need a bridge loan. I just need you to cover the rest right now, and I will give you everything. I'll sign the house over to you, Arthur. Take the house. I looked down at the velvet box. I looked at the silver teapot she had prized so much, the one Mom only brought out on Thanksgiving, now sitting discarded on the cheap rug. Your house has $100,000 in equity, Sarah. I said, my voice steady, though my stomach churned a slow, sickening rotation. And it has a second lien on it, because Greg used it to back his logistics business. If I pay this ransom, they take my money. The logistics creditors take your house. You'll be homeless. Greg will be a husk, and we both end up with nothing. I don't care, she shrieked, grabbing the doorframe, her wet fingers slipping on the painted wood. He is my husband. You can't let him die over math. It's not math. It's reality. I reached down and picked up the ring box, the papers, in the silver teapot. I gently pushed them back through the gap in the door. They clattered onto her lap. Go home, Sarah, I said softly. Call the FBI back. Give them the new video. There is nothing for you here. She didn't grab the items. She just stayed on her knees, staring up at me. The fury drained out of her face, leaving a cavernous, empty look that chilled me more than the cold wind from the open window. You're dead to me, she whispered. The words weren't a threat. They were a eulogy. You died today, Arthur. You're not my brother anymore. You're just a ghost in a box. She didn't wait for a response. She clumsily gathered the silver and the papers, shoving them back into the wet canvas bag. She stood up, her joints popping, and turned her back to me. She walked down the hallway, her wet shoes squeaking slightly on the floorboards. I closed the door. I unhooked the chain, locked the deadbolt, and slid the secondary bolt into place. I walked back to the kitchen. The digital clock on the oven read 5:12 p.m. I turned the burner on high. I placed a heavy carbon steel skillet on the flame. I waited until the metal began to smoke, a thin, white wisp rising toward the vent. I dropped a tablespoon of beef tallow into the pan. It instantly melted, shimmering like liquid glass, the rich, meaty smell filling the room, overpowering the phantom scent of Sarah's damp wool coat. I took the ribeye and laid it in the pan. The sear was deafening, a violent, aggressive hiss that drowned out the sound of the rain, the sound of the city, and the silence of my phone buried in the junk drawer. I pressed the meat down with a spatula, ensuring maximum contact with the screaming hot steel, watching the edges immediately crisp and turn a deep mahogany brown. The clock ticked. 5:50 p.m. I flipped the steak. The crust was perfect. I dropped a heavy knob of unsalted butter into the pan, along with the crushed garlic and the sprig of rosemary I had prepped earlier. 5:55 p.m. The butter foamed instantly, turning brown and nutty. I tilted the pan, grabbing a large spoon, and began to baste the steak. The hot, aromatic fat cascaded over the crusted meat. Sizzle, splash, sizzle. I repeated the motion, a hypnotic, repetitive rhythm. 6 p.m. The deadline. I didn't stop basting. I didn't pause. I took the steak off the heat, transferring it to a clean wooden board to rest. The residual heat continued to cook it from the inside out, the juices redistributing, locking in the flavor. I stood in my kitchen, the smell of roasted garlic, rosemary, and seared beef wrapping around me like a heavy, warm blanket. Thousands of miles away, a decision was being made in a concrete room. But in my kitchen, the only thing that mattered was that the meat needed to rest for 10 minutes before I carved it. 6 months later, April, the spring air in the city was thin and bright, carrying the smell of wet pavement and exhaust fumes, stripped of the heavy humidity of summer. I was standing across the street from a low-income housing complex in Queens. The brick facade was stained with soot, and the chain-link fence surrounding the small courtyard was bowed and rusted. I had my hands deep in the pockets of my light jacket. I watched the entrance. At 2:15 p.m., a woman walked out. It took me a moment to recognize her. Sarah had aged a decade in 6 months. Her blonde hair, once perfectly highlighted and styled, was cut short, pinned back with a cheap plastic claw. She wore gray scrubs and white sneakers that looked heavy on her feet. The defiant, entitled posture was gone. She walked with her shoulders rounded, her eyes fixed on the cracked pavement. Behind her, shuffling out of the glass double doors, was Greg. He didn't look like the confident, slick-talking crypto bro who had convinced my sister to marry him. He looked like a scarecrow stuffed with dry leaves. He was wearing sweatpants that swallowed his frame and a faded t-shirt. He walked with a pronounced limp favoring his left leg. As he reached for the gate, I saw his right hand. He was wearing a fingerless compression glove, but it couldn't hide the fact that his index and middle fingers ended abruptly at the second knuckle. They hadn't killed him. Agent Miller had been right. When 6 p.m. passed and no money hit the cartel's escrow account, they didn't put a bullet in Greg's head. Instead, they cut off his fingers to prove a point. And when Sarah finally desperately liquidated everything she owned, selling her house for a fraction of its worth to a predatory cash buyer, draining her retirement, selling her car, she managed to scrape together $80,000. The cartel took it, and then, realizing there was absolutely nothing left to squeeze, they dumped Greg at a border checkpoint in Maysot. The State Department flew him home. But the Greg that came back was a hollow shell. From what little I gathered through public records and a brief, unsolicited email from an aunt, Greg spent his days staring at the wall in their subsidized apartment. He jumped at loud noises. He couldn't work. Sarah was working double shifts as a medical receptionist just to keep the lights on and pay off the predatory loan she took to cover the immediate medical bills. I watched them walk down the street toward a bus stop. They didn't speak to each other. There was a chasm between them, filled with resentment, trauma, and the crushing weight of poverty. A pang of something hit my chest. It wasn't regret. It was pity. A cold, distant pity, like watching a documentary about a disaster in a country you've never visited. If I had paid, if I had sacrificed my apartment and my life in that jungle, they would still be miserable. Greg would have found another scheme. Sarah would have demanded more. The fire would have consumed my house just to briefly warm theirs. And then we would all be standing in the ashes. I turned away before they could look across the street. I walked down into the subway station, the smell of ozone and damp earth greeting me like an old friend. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, the silence was total. The afternoon sun was pouring through the large window in the living room, casting long, golden geometric shapes across the clean hardwood floor. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the coffee I had brewed that morning. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door. I walked into the kitchen. I opened the fridge and pulled out a block of sharp cheddar, a loaf of sourdough I had bought from the bakery downstairs, and a jar of Dijon mustard. I took out a heavy cast iron pan and set it on the stove, turning the flame on medium-low. I buttered the outside of the thick slices of bread edge to edge. I smeared the mustard on the inside, layering the cheese generously. I laid the sandwich into the warm pan. It sizzled gently, a quiet, comforting sound. I watched the butter melt into the pores of the bread, turning it a deep, crispy, golden brown. I flipped at the cheese in the center, beginning to ooze, perfectly melted. I plated it on a ceramic dish, poured a glass of cold water, and sat at my small dining table by the window. I took a bite. The crunch of the toasted sourdough was loud in the quiet room. The sharp tang of the mustard cut through the rich, heavy fat of the cheddar. It was a simple meal. It was a simple life. I looked around my apartment. I still had the deed. I still had my peace. I still had my pulse. I had let the world burn outside my door, and I had learned to love the smell of the smoke. I chewed slowly, watching the city below me. They tell you that family is everything, but sometimes the only way to survive a drowning man is to pry his fingers off your throat and let him sink. I didn't save Greg, and I didn't save Sarah, but for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I saved myself. If this story struck a nerve, if you know what it's like to finally say no and watch the fallout from a distance, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs permission to walk away. And don't forget to subscribe. Survival isn't pretty, but it's real.